Welcome, students, to our very first study session together. So this is for exam number 1. I am going to briefly go through your study guide number 1 to cover chapters 1 through 7, making sure you have the correct information to prepare for our upcoming exam. Okay, so number 1, what is human development? What are we going to be talking about all semester long? We're going to talk about how and why. How and why are we different? How and why do we change or remain the same over time? So we're exploring what makes us unique and different from the person next to us. What are the 5 steps of the scientific method? So remember, 5 steps in the scientific method. The first one is that you're curious about something, right? So something piques your interest and you're curious about that. Therefore, you pose a question. You want to know what if. Okay. The second one is we form a hypothesis, right? And our hypothesis is a specific prediction that can be tested, right? So for the exam, you might find something like an example of a hypothesis, such as Dr. So-and-so believes that they have discovered a cure for pediatric leukemia, and that by giving pediatric patients this drug for 6 months, the patients will improve their white blood cell count by 30%, right? So that's a very specific prediction, and that would be an example on the exam, and you would know that that is a hypothesis, right? So the third step, again, in that scientific method is that we go ahead and we test, right? We need to implement the study, do the study, so we can figure out, basically, the 4th step. Did it work or did it not work? So can I support my hypothesis? Was it correct? Or refute, which means that it wasn't, right? So which one of those? Is it support or refute your hypothesis? And the 5th step in the scientific method is to report those results or share it with the community, right? So that people can take that study and they can expand upon it, try something different. So reporting your results is the 5th step in that scientific method. We already talked about what a hypothesis is, therefore, nature versus nurture. So when we talk about nature, we're talking about genetics. When we talk about nurture, we're referring to the environment. So remember, we said that, working together, development as a result of these 2 things, nature and nurture, working together. So we're a combination. We're not completely based upon our genes, and we're also not completely based upon our family or our culture or society. We take both of those 2 things into consideration when you think about how did we get here? How do we develop into who we are? The lifespan perspective takes into account what stages of life, and this is one that students miss on the exam, right? Because most students are going to select that for this class, we're going to talk about birth through death. But in actuality, right, in this class, we talk about conception to death, what I like to call from the womb to the tomb, right? So we're going to talk about the entire lifespan because remember in the chapters that we've covered recently, we talked about the zygote. We talked about that one cell that forms before this baby is born, and so that's conception. So conception to death is the answer there. So what's a cohort? Remember, a cohort's a group of people that basically share or are born in the same time frame and share some unique experiences together. So for the exam, you might find something like an example of a cohort. And what's an example of a cohort? We talked about that your high school graduating class is a cohort, so that would be an example. What is SES? So SES stands for socioeconomic status. Remember, we said that this is based upon several things. It's based upon your income, your wealth that you have, your education, right? Your neighborhood that you live in, where you live, and your occupation, what you do for a living. So these are the things that make up our, what we like to call social class. So SES, another term for it would be your social class. Are you low income, middle income, or upper income? As a society here in the West, we tend to place people in a class category, and that's what that means. So social class. Life expectancy can be shortened by what? We said in class, it can be shortened by low SES, or basically the lower your class is, the shorter lifespan you will have. And that is based upon the fact that when you don't have money, you don't have access to good health care and access to adequate nutrition, right? Access to information. And so those things lead to you not living as long as somebody who is middle income or upper income. What type of construction is race? We spent some time in class talking about that race is a social construct, right? So we as a society have determined what race looks like. If I give you a what you might refer to as a racial group, your mind automatically conjures up a picture of what you think the physical characteristics of that group should be, right? And therefore we know it's flawed. It's inaccurate, right? Because it's really not correct, our pictures of race. What's the definition of culture? So culture is a system of shared beliefs, conventions, norms, behaviors, and expectations. So I said before, culture is a lot more than the foods we eat, the clothing that we wear. It is really these shared ideas and values that we pass down from generation to generation. Explain the difference between race and ethnicity. So they're very not different. They're very different, correct? They are two different things. So when we talk about race, we already said that's a social construct. It's something that we think of or picture in our mind. Ethnicity is when we refer to your heritage. We refer to what ethnic group, what country or place did you come from originally, that you then have that heritage passed down or comes down from your lineage. And so race and ethnicity are very, very different. They are not at all the same thing. All right, chapter 2, what's a norm? So norm is a standard or average or usual event or experience, right? So we said a norm is very different based on where you live, even in the East Coast and the West Coast or the southern part of the US, very different norms. What's a reinforcement? Reinforcement is a consequence that follows a behavior and makes that person likely to repeat that behavior, right? So we reinforce to our children if they earn good grades and we give them a prize or a Lego set or something that they want. We're encouraging them, or we're trying to reinforce, do it again. Do it again because I want to reward you again, right? Another term for observational learning is modeling, right? Pavlov's experiments exemplify what kind of conditioning. Remember, Pavlov is the one that did the experiments with dogs. So we talked about how the bell would ding and the dog would salivate because the dog knew when the bell would ring, there was food coming, right? And so Pavlov is the theorist that we associate with classical conditioning, right? He conditioned this dog to associate the sound of the bell means food, and I automatically salivate. Even when no food came, the dog still salivated every time he heard the bell. And that's classical conditioning. We can condition. What type of experiments did Pavlov conduct? He did experiments on dogs, right? Social learning theory occurs how? From observing and imitating others, okay? So sometimes with a social learning theory, there's no actual communication between the person who's observing and the person who's being observed, right? So again, you may just have a role model or somebody that you aspire to that you've never actually talked to, but you watch them and you observe them socially and you learn from that, right? Let's see here. Skinner's study of behavior is based on what type of conditioning? So remember, Skinner says that if we use operant conditioning, we can take our learning a step further because operant conditioning now adds in rewards and punishment. So rewards and punishment, operant conditioning is Skinner. Cognitive theory is founded on a person's thoughts and expectations, right? So it's really understanding how the brain works on what you're thinking and what your expectation is at a specific age level or maturity of the brain. Piaget's definition of assimilation is new experiences are interpreted to fit into our old ideas. So every time we encounter something, especially if it's different from what we know, we make it fit into what we used to think. All right, sociocultural approach focuses on what three characteristics and not on what. So when we talk about Vygotsky and the sociocultural approach, we talk about culture, right? We talk about our ethics, right? And we talk about sexuality. What we don't talk about is genes. We don't talk about your DNA or your genetic material, because the sociocultural theorist believes that we are products of society and of these three things that we just mentioned. So again, culture, ethics, sexuality, not genes. Humanism. Humanism theory stresses the potential for all humans for good, a belief that all people have the same basic makeup regardless of their culture, gender, and background. So remember, humanism would be the opposite of the sociocultural approach. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, remember that triangle that we talked about that had these levels we had to go up. In that level, or in that triangle, the very first level we encounter is what we call the physiological needs. And the physiological needs refer to our basic needs for life. So we all need to have water and food and shelter. That's just number one. Until we have those things, we can't climb up that triangle. We can't go up the ladder. We really don't care about people respecting us or self-esteem until I have my basic needs left. Let's see here. What two long-standing biological drives does every species have? Number one is survival. We mentioned as an example that this is why we will resort to cannibalism, because it is inbred in us to survive, to live. And the other one is reproduction. And so we want to leave behind a generation after us. We want to bear children. All right, chapter 3, chromosome is your DNA, right? So your chromosome equals DNA. Where are our genes located? Our genes are located on those chromosomes, right? We talked about how they're like these little X and Y things here. The genome. The genome is a full, complete set of your genes. Full and complete set of genes. An allele is a variation of a gene. A variation, difference in a gene. And a zygote is that single cell that's formed by a sperm, an ova, or an egg, right? The 23rd pair of female chromosomes looks like XX. So if I said, what does it look like? You're going to say the 23rd pair of a female looks like two X's. Remember, a male would be an X and a Y. What determines whether a baby was born as a girl or a boy? It is the male the male who donates that Y chromosome at the 23rd pair. The male donates the Y chromosome. Stem cells are able to reproduce any other cell in the body. IVF. Remember, we talked about the process in IVF. An ova or egg is surgically removed from mom. It's fertilized in a glass petri dish. By fertilized, I mean that we provide the sperm, and then it is hopefully reimplanted back into mom to carry to term. The Human Genome Project is a worldwide effort to map the complete human genetic code. So what are we made of? Alcoholism is caused by a combination of nature and nurture. So we talked about that there is a gene for alcoholism. However, there are also environmental factors that can cause someone to turn to alcoholism or become an alcoholic. And so we say it's a combination of nature and nurture. Down syndrome is the most common chromosomal abnormality. Remember, we have an extra chromosome in Down syndrome. At the 21st pair, there's 3 chromosomes instead of 2. Who is at greatest risk of having a child with a chromosomal abnormality? We showed you a slide and said that it's really moms over 40 who need to be concerned. So the older we are, moms, the older our eggs are, and the greater chances we have of having a child born with a chromosomal abnormality. Genetic counseling is testing by trained experts to learn genetic heritage of a couple, right? They're learning what type of harmful conditions could this couple possibly pass down to their child if they conceive a baby? So couples will go if they know that their family has a history of problems. Chapter 4, the 3 main stages of prenatal development: the germinal period, the embryonic period, and the fetal period, right? And we said the longest of those is the third one, the fetal stage. Natural conception implantation percentage. Remember, we said that we lose about 50% within that first 2 weeks of implantation or attempting to implant, right? So 50% is the number there. The critical factor in attaining that age of viability is brain development. We need to reach, remember, at least week 22. That is the age of viability, because at that point, hopefully the fetus's brain is developed enough to live outside the womb. What 2 things do babies do on their own at birth? They breathe and they cry. That's what we hope. They're breathing on their own and crying. What specific physical qualities does the Apgar scale measure? Right? It measures your color, heart rate, cry, your muscle tone or reflexes, and breathing. The Apgar scale is used to evaluate the overall health of a newborn. Induced labor is when we use a drug to start labor because it's not happening, right? To speed up or strengthen labor. And again, we're using drugs. A doula is a person who supports mom through this birth process. So it's similar to a midwife. We call it a doula. Cesarean section is a surgical birth. An incision is made through the mother's abdomen and uterus for quick removal of this baby. So cesarean section is surgical birth. Fetal alcohol syndrome, we talked about this. Fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, refers to when pregnant mom, has been drinking alcohol during her pregnancy. And unfortunately, there's consequences for the fetus and ultimately for the child. And so an example would be if maybe I think one of our slides said that if you had a friend who was in her 3rd month of pregnancy and you notice that she's excessively drinking, what are you concerned about? We're concerned about FAS for this child. Father's presence at birth. Remember, research shows us it reduces the likelihood of complications at birth. So dad just being somewhere where a birth is happening, not necessarily in the room, brings some type of a calm upon mom that we have fewer complications. Postpartum depression, 8 to 15% of moms face postpartum depression. Rooting reflex. The rooting reflex is when an infant turns their head when you brush their cheek. So when you brush their cheek, an infant automatically turns their head and starts to do the sucking motion because they want to eat. Chapter 5, when 2 children begin to walk? At about 12 months. So about a year is average when we start to see our kids walking. When do children reach half of their adult height? At the age of 2. At the age of 2, they've reached half their adult height. Synapses are intersections that neurons meet at. So when a brain cell, remember neurons are brain cells, so when a brain cell is trying to communicate or talk to another brain cell, that synapse is kind of like that little in-between area. And neurotransmitters are the brain chemicals that carry the information from one neuron to the other neuron. Shaken baby syndrome is a life-threatening condition when infants are shaken back and forth, which can lead to death. Right? Shaken baby syndrome. Lullabies, newborns like them. So newborns are especially responsive to lullabies, and that's why we play a lot of those music or sounds in the mobiles that babies have in their cribs. Co-sleeping. When we talk about co-sleeping, remember co-sleeping is just parents sleeping or caregivers sleeping with the child. And we see 2 things. We see, number 1, there's a lot of cultural influences. We talked about how, if you look at the slide of the different countries that practice co-sleeping, there's a great disparity. And maybe some of the Asian countries compared to the US. And other countries, and whether or not you practice co-sleeping. In addition, co-sleeping is a lot easier for nighttime feeding. So a lot easier for nighttime feeding. Which emotion is apparent at birth? Pain. Pain. Motor skills is the ability to move and control parts of the body. Gross and fine motor skills. So gross motor skills refer to the large body movements, whereas fine motor skills refer to the small body movements. Infant and child mortality. This has decreased. So this is a good thing. So we talk about infant and child mortality, we mean death. So the death of our kids has taken a slight decline. And the reason for that is that we're getting a lot more clean water into a lot of third world countries. Immunizations we're bringing into other countries. Nourishing food. Again, we're getting a better diet for individuals. And these three things have had a dramatic impact on the amount of our children and babies that are living. Breast milk. Breast milk is the best thing for babies, right? Breast milk provides antibodies that fight disease, and breast milk is more digestible than formula because it doesn't have the fats and sugar that formula has in it. So two things. Breast milk provides antibodies for the baby that could only be found in breast milk, and also it's better for a child or more digestible than formula because it doesn't have the fats and sugar. Autism. It is a myth that the MMR vaccine causes autism. So there's been extensive research and we just don't find that to be true. Chapter 6, object permanence. So object permanence is when your baby understands that objects continue to exist even when they can't see them. So remember, around 9 months, our babies start to realize that you're just playing peekaboo. You didn't actually disappear on them. Let's see, assimilation. I think assimilation is when we interpret putting our new experiences into old ideas. We talked about that already. Information processing theory. So this is when we kind of compare a baby's mind to that of a computer. So it's comparing human thinking processes, how our mind works, by analogy to computer and how a computer analyzes data. Affordances. Affordances are environmental opportunities to interact. So as parents, we want to give our children as many affordances as possible. During the newborn period, their primary means of communication is reflexive. Remember, a newborn is really, we're talking 3 months and under. Excuse me. So very young babies, they just react. Their body is being reflexive, reacting. We talked about the hiccuping and the shivering and the different things the baby is doing to try and communicate what they need. Infants' perception of death. We use the visual clipped experiment to determine how an infant's brain works and how it perceives death. When do children develop cognitively, according to Piaget? So according to Piaget, our cognitive theorist, when do children start to think in their brain? And really, birth. The answer is at birth. Newborns prefer mom's language. So whatever language their mother speaks, that is the language they will prefer. The age of word recognition. So this is when you can understand what your baby is saying. About 12 months. So about 12 months, or a year is when we start to see that our children are saying words. Gesturing. Gesturing is the primary means of communication for infants. Remember, infants is 12 months and under. 12 months and over, toddlers. So infants' primary means of communication, they're pointing, they're gesturing at what they want because they can't yet speak. The order of spoken language development in our infants and children is going to be, first they start off reflexively with the reflexes, right, when they're newborns. Then they go to the cooing sound, cooing. Then they go to babbling, and then they go to actual spoken words. What theorist says children learn language as a result of reinforcements? Skinner. So remember, Skinner says that the more that we practice our words with our children and the more that we reward them when they say the word and do well, we reinforce what is correct and what we want them to do. Chapter 7, emotions in infants. Which is the last to develop and which is the first to be expressed or felt? So the last to develop is pride, and the first to be felt is pain. Last to develop pride, first to feel pain. Stranger weariness. Stranger weariness is an infant's distress at seeing an unfamiliar person And especially if mom reacts or is anxious to that person, that just kind of heightens a child's anxiety. So again, stranger weariness is that anxiety or distress a baby has at an unfamiliar person. Separation anxiety. So separation anxiety is when a baby acts upset because their caregiver is leaving. And this is normal and natural. We want our children to feel this separation anxiety. 4 categories of temperaments that our babies can be born with are easy, difficult, slow to warm up, or hard to classify. So it's just kind of luck of the draw of which of those 4 you get. Synchrony. Synchrony is this coordinated interaction between caregiver and infant. So coordinated interaction between the caregiver, mom, dad, grandma, whoever's raising this baby, and the infant. Fathers with infants, right? So compared to moms, we know that dads are actually better at doing 2 things. So dads are better at engaging in physical play. So romping around with babies, just doing physical play. And they're also better at making our babies laugh. So 2 things that dad do better is physical play and laughing with our babies. Attachment, right? We've talked about how important attachment is. Attachment is a lasting emotional bond that an infant forms with at least one caregiver, right? Lasting emotional bond. Secure attachment. When a child has secure attachment, it makes them willing to explore, right? Because they are secure enough to know that their caregiver is coming back. They trust their caregiver. Child's activity during the oral stage and the anal stage, according to Freud. So in the oral stage, it would be typical for our babies to be sucking on pacifiers, right? Putting everything in their mouth. And then during the anal stage, Freud would say that this is a time that our babies are controlling their bowels, right? Or attempting to get potty trained. Erickson's theory says infants' earliest task, this is the first of the 8 different stages that we'll be talking about all semester about how we develop into healthy adults. The first stage, Erickson says, is trust versus mistrust. And we mentioned that's why that attachment is so crucial, because early in life really does set a trajectory or a plan for whether or not an individual will develop healthy relationships with trust. Self-rule or autonomy. So when a baby has self-rule, self-control and self-rule or autonomy, it's being able to control their body, right? So remember during that anal stage, and infants actually, they find pleasure in trying to stimulate their bowels and go to the bathroom or go potty on their own, right? And that's normal for them to do. And this being able to go to be potty trained, being able to even start to put on their shoes by themselves and do some of these things allows them to feel some self-esteem, which is really that self-rule and that autonomy. Problems and conflicts from early childhood could adversely affect one's adult personality. So remember, we've already seen as an example how important trust versus mistrust is, because if you developed, unfortunately, that mistrust, then it hinders having healthy relationships romantically and even in relationships and friendships with others. Proximal parenting. So we talked about distal and proximal parenting. Proximal parenting is caregiving involving being very physically close with frequent handling and touching and engagement or interaction with your child. All right, guys, that is our study session for exam number 1. See you soon.